ago was that? 107. None of us, not even our grandparents were born then. But in 1900, Korea is a country about a bit bigger than the South Island of New Zealand, but many, many more people live in it. And it's sort of like a thumb, and it hangs down and it comes off northern Russia and China. So they're its neighbours, are way up here in the north. And in 1905 the Japanese came and they occupied Korea. And they were very cruel. They virtually made slaves out of the Korean people, and for 40 years the Koreans had to put up with this, and they hated the Japanese. 40 years later, World War II was ending, and the Americans came in to drive out the Japanese, and they came in from the south here and started moving up the peninsula, clearing out the Japanese, and the Russians away in the north. At the time they didn't like the Americans, and the Americans didn't like them, and the Russians said, we're not having any of this nonsense, and so they came in from the north. And so there were Russian troops coming from the north, American troops coming from the south, and they met right in the middle at a place called the 38th parallel. Now these are the parallel latitude lines that New Zealand, what's New Zealand on about? Something you might look up, I can't think. And so the 38th parallel was the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. And the Russians were communists, so they persuaded, after about 4 or 5 years, they had persuaded the Koreans in the north that communism was good, and they became communists. The Americans in the south persuaded the southerners that democracy was good. And so over the next 5 years, the south became very democratic. But they wanted their country reunited. They didn't like being in two halves. The south didn't know how to go about it. The north thought they did, and they invaded the south. They brought their troops and their tanks down. And the Americans weren't having any of this, so they persuaded the United Nations to help them, and they went in, together with the British, New Zealand, Australian, and 18 countries altogether. They went in from the south, and that's how the war started, and it went on for 3.5 years.